Um, and there you go. I just got the message. A new video has been started. Okay, so let me see what else I'm going to, uh, where I'm going to go now. Okay, so in that previous video, which is now part 5, um, I recapped some of what I said in the first 4 videos, totaling 95 minutes. So I'm going to quickly recap something else before moving into the new material. And that is how I had talked about the issue of godhood. I just mentioned at the end of the previous segment that I have a lot to say about Psalm 82, verses 6 and 7. I have said to your God, to your sons of the Most High, yet you would die like mere men and fall like a prince. And that Jesus reiterated that psalm when he said in John chapter 10, verse 34, know ye not that it is written, ye are gods. Okay, so you've heard me say that a few times. I won't keep saying that. But anyway, let me see. I think that there might be one or two other things I want to remind you of before I move on. Oh, yeah. So, um, I talked about how you got these first 2 levels of thought, what I call achievement and then what I call demandingness, both of which uh, are sub-rational. And that rationale corresponds with the first apocalyptic horse. That apocalyptic horseman represents rationale and then maybe a number of other things. Second one represents the conceptual thought. He's the horse whose rider was given power to make war. And the third horse is given a set of balances. It goes out saying, a measure wheat for a day's wages, 3 measures of barley for a day's wages. And that represents famine, inflation, low return on investment, but it also corresponds with this 11th sphere of thought in the mind. And God is working on getting people to think and become godly and develop this God element in their mind, but he's getting low ROI, but he knows that that's going to be the case. And that's why he gave us this revelation, this vision. He's already aware that not many people are going to make the mark. And he actually doesn't love most people, I should tell you. But I won't expound on that right now. But there's godhood, the 11th sphere of thought, and there actually is a 12th sphere of thought that can be developed in the mind. So before I go into that, though, let me say that this God element is the last of the emotional parts of the mind. That you see, a dictator or any other person who has this God element who's thought really hard, they didn't think really hard for nothing. They thought really hard because they were faced with some tough situations. And now that they've figured things out, they want to force that concept of life out toward others, but it is a concept of life, not a concept of death. Okay, they want people to live, but they want them to live in a certain way. They have their idea of peace. These demigods, these people who have thought themselves into godhood, who have developed an organized concept of life and have an organized mindset like a dictator. So they have their concept of life. They've thought through a lot of problems. They've come up with solutions. They've generalized the types of things that they believe people need to do in order for life to go well. And then, of course, they want to force it out against people who are resistant, but who don't want to think hard enough either. So you got a few people who think hard enough to become demigods, and you got many people who don't, and then the many with their less organized way of thinking want to have as much say so as the hard thinkers, the very intelligent people, and I know that that's kind of written into American democracy, but it doesn't make a bit of fucking sense. Okay, uh, if you're considerably less intelligent than someone, you shouldn't have the same amount of freedom that they have. If you don't even like to think and try to increase your intelligence, then you surely shouldn't have as much freedom as somebody who can and will think hard and long and well and rationally. That's just the way it is. Okay, so this 11th sphere of thought does still want there to be life, but is willing to take the lives of the problem makers in order to let other people live in peace. And that begins to explain, oh man, that now, I think about him all the time, but now against uh, uh, Bashar al-Assad, Syria, you know. So I'm not saying that he's a great guy. I'm not saying he's a nice guy. Now, but he does have his concept of life, his concept of society, and what he thinks it should be like, you know. And for all we know, he may very well have a very nice vision for society, but he's doing a little something that I find myself doing, although with a very different application, because I'm not a dictator. Okay, but what I find myself doing and have done for a number of years now is I've talked a lot about grim realities. I've talked a lot about God being a hard God. I've talked a lot about God being a God of necessary evils. And I focus on scriptures like Psalm 82, 6 and 7, John chapter 10, verse 34. But my favorite verse, my absolute favorite verse, is Isaiah 45, 7, which says, I form light and create darkness. I make good and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. It doesn't allow you to put God in this box of goodness, especially your box of goodness, your brand of goodness, which you think is right. No. He's the creator. He decides how things are. He decides what he says is right. Okay. And so, anyway, so I'm constantly focused on getting people to understand that, like the song says, sovereign, sovereign, the Lord our God is sovereign. God can do whatever he wants to do. God can do whatever he wants to do when he wants to. Mm-hmm. God can do whatever he wants to do where he wants to, how he wants to. Sovereign God is God. And so that's been my focus, getting people to realize that, getting people to stop trying to make God out to be sweet, stop trying to make him out to be all good, realize that he can do whatever the heck he wants to do, realize that that is the focus in the story of Job, that God himself said that Job was a righteous man, and God himself gave Satan permission to tempt Job, and when Satan went back for the beginning of round 2, God did not say, hey, you know, that was really foul that you killed most of Job's loved ones. There's no record of God having cried foul on Satan for killing all but one of Job's offspring, all but one of Job's servants, all of Job's livestock, which probably weren't among his loved ones. But so in the first round, God says, don't touch his body. But then Satan kills most of his loved ones, and God doesn't cry foul about that. In the second round, God says, okay, you can touch his body, but don't kill him. And that's exactly what Satan did. Okay, Satan obeys God. But the moral of the story of Job is that you don't have to be doing something wrong for God to allow hardship to come upon you or for God to initiate that hardship. God actually initiated the hardship. Okay, it was God who mentioned Job in the conversation between God and Satan. And if God knows all things before they happen, then God should have known how Satan was gonna respond. And then God set the parameters and said, okay, you can do this, but no more. And later on in the New Testament, we see where Jesus tells his disciples, Satan has demanded to sift you like wheat. Just like Satan went to God and said, hey, let me do this to Job. Satan went to God apparently and said, hey, let me do this to the disciples. And scripture tells us that after Jesus was baptized, he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. I'd have to assume it was the Spirit of God. But the moral of the story of Job is you don't have to be doing wrong in order for God to actually initiate hardships in your life. Okay, you could be a righteous man like God called Job at the beginning of the book of Job. Okay, and God might just decide he wants to toss the dice with Satan and make a bet on whether or not you'll curse him to his face. Now, I don't know what God would have done if Job had cursed him to his face. I would imagine God would have killed him, but because Job did not curse God, we don't know for certain. Like I said earlier in this series of videos, I learned at an early age that, hey, once life events take a certain turn, you can never prove beyond the shadow of a doubt what would have happened if A had not happened, or what would have happened if how things would have gone if B had happened instead of A. You can never prove what would have been once your life goes down an irreversible path. Okay, so anyway, we just won't know what the outcome would have been if Job had decided to curse God's face, but I'm not going to be the one to curse God to his face, and I'm not going to try to find out what God does to people like that, okay? No matter what kind of hardships God brings upon me. And I say that fearfully because God might be saying, okay, let me see. Let me do this. Let's hope that's not the case. But anyway, getting back to so I explained that I'm focused so much on getting people to understand God's sovereignty and that they don't have any right to oppose God no matter what he does to them. And I talk a lot about necessary evils, God being the God of or a God of necessary evils, and that is just my focus, and I won't get away from that because people have not yet gotten to a place where they can comfortably and fluidly talk about these things the way that I just did. Okay, if you can't talk about God's harshness and the fact that because he's God, he can do whatever the heck he wants to do, if you can't talk about it that fluidly, and if you can't emphasize that we have no right to say what's right or wrong for God to do, if you just can't get there and it's not something that you can become comfortable with and talk about it fluidly and frequently, or at least be comfortable when the topic comes up. Maybe you won't say it as frequently as me, but at least talk about it comfortably when the topic comes up and show that you've really wrapped your head around it, then I'm going to keep on drilling that into you. The more that I see it hurts you, the more I'm going to drill it into you until you get it, or until judgment day comes and you're forced to realize it when you go before God, okay? And people don't like when I say this, but if you deny God's existence and you end up in hell, I'm going to laugh at your calamity, just like God told Israel that if they didn't obey him, he would laugh at their calamity. I will laugh at your calamity if you end up in hell because you would not believe in God, okay? I'm not saying that that's going to necessarily be the case. You might go through your entire life not believing in God, and you still might not end up in hell. The story of the sheep and the goats, or the parable of the sheep and the goats, I should say, kind of makes that point that there were people who fed the hungry and clothed the naked, even though they didn't recognize Jesus as Lord, and he says, "Come into my kingdom, you want it or not." There were others who went to church and sang the hymns, but didn't clothe the naked, didn't feed the hungry, and Jesus says, "Depart from me, thou worker of iniquity, I never knew you." Just like he's going to turn to these nuns and say, "Depart from me, thou worker of no iniquity, I never knew you." Okay, but so, and I'm serious, but I am. Sounds a little, like I'm trying to be funny, but I'm serious. And so anyway, um, I will continue that focus, but I can see where Bashar al-Assad probably is like, hey, look, you people are going to learn that I'm the dictator here, and the Bible does very strongly suggest that God supports dictatorship and that God does not support democracy. And when I was in Christian school, we talked about how that all Bible Day societies were male dominated, all Bible Day societies were dictatorships, that God actually set a number of those dictators on their thrones, okay? And so God never, it's not recorded in the Bible that God ever told any national leader to implement a democratic process. And Solomon, who at least at the beginning of his reign was given so much wisdom by God, one of the first things he did was have some of his father's enemies killed. Okay, and there's an instance where some guy who he had ordered to be killed ran into the temple and grabbed the horns of the altar, and the guys who would have been sent to kill him went back to King Solomon. He grabbed the horns of the altar, and Solomon was like, hey, he can't let the church protect him. He can't let the synagogue protect him. He can't let the temple protect him. No, that guy needs to die. Slay him at the altar. And so they went back and they slayed him at the altar. Okay, and so, but anyway, Solomon did his share of harsh things. He didn't shed as much blood as his father David, so he was allowed to build the temple since he did not shed blood to the degree that his father David did. But anyway, there's plenty of biblical support for dictatorship, and there's very strong suggestion that God actually supports dictatorship, and it doesn't actually say that he does not support democracy. I don't think the Bible actually addresses democracy one way or the other, and but it does give you plenty of reason to believe that God supports dictatorship. Okay, you may not like that, but it's just the truth. And so I can kind of see where, in much the same way that I am constantly focused on getting people to understand that God is a dictator, and that God is a God of necessary evils, and that God is not nice, and that God actually has very little love for very few people. He loved Job, but he didn't give a rat's ass about Job's offspring and servants being killed. I would imagine Job was a demigod who had thought himself into godhood, and God appreciated Job's level of thought. Okay, and don't quote me on that, but I would just have to assume that until proven otherwise. So it didn't come from God. I didn't say that God said it. I said that I ascertained it from the scriptures. But so, in much the same way that I have that constant focus on getting people to understand that God's a dictator and that, they can't tell God what's right or wrong for him to do, and they can't come up with their ideas as to what would be a good, loving, nice thing for God to do, because God's not beholden to their idea of goodness. God's not beholden to any idea of goodness. He said he does good and evil. He forms light and creates darkness. He does all these things, okay? So don't try to put him in a box of goodness, okay? And he said that during his introduction of himself to King Cyrus. And when you say, and during an introduction, you basically tell someone what you think is most important for them to know about you. So apparently, God thinks that it's very important for a king like Cyrus was to know that God does both good and evil. But I can see where Bashar al-Assad, with his demigodhood, with his concept of life that he's pushing out toward people, uh, he's like, look, I'm going to maintain this focus of you having to recognize my dictatorship, my rights as a dictator, that I'm in charge and you're going to do what the fuck I say, whether you like it or not. And he's going to maintain that focus unless and until people finally say, okay, uh, King Bashar al-Assad will obey your every word. And once they get there, he might stop all the killing. Okay, I haven't actually heard any recent news out of Syria, so maybe that's already happened. Maybe people have already gotten it. Uh, I do know that, well, first of all, I came to DC in the summer of 2005, and um, in 2006, I was by Washington, D.C.'s Freedom Plaza, and these Iranian women who I think actually live here in the U.S. now. They might have traveled here, but to live here permanent. I mean, they might have traveled here. I mean, temporarily, but I think they were actually living here permanently in 2006. I don't think that they were still actually living in Iran. But in any instance, they were speaking up for the Iranian people, and they were saying how that the Iranian government, is totalitarian. And this was only about a year after Mahmoud Ahmadinejad had taken power. And they said that for the last 10 or 12 years at that time, that certain things had been happening. And they emphasized that it wasn't something that they were saying against Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, that they were speaking against the way that the Iranian government functions across administrations. And so one of the women said to me, you go into the store with your kids, and these Gestapo type people, they smack your kid upside the head. And they were saying how that a lot of people had been killed. I think it was something like 12,000 people had been killed in the last, what was then the last 10 or 12 years, by the Iranian government for their dissent. And they wanted the U.S. to stop that from happening. But when they told me how, you go into the store and these Gestapo types, they smack your kid upside the head. I said, well, and then you fight them, and then they kill you. So, if you probably would have been better off letting your kid get smacked in the head and just being glad that you walk away in one piece, and your kid's still in one piece, But then you fight them, and they kill you, and now your kid's an orphan, okay? So, by comparison, I think that even the kid would have preferred to just get smacked in the head than to become an orphan, okay? But, and I told him, you can't run headlong into the slaughter. It doesn't make any sense. But yeah, so Do I think that God supports the specific brand of dictatorship that exists in this or that country? Not necessarily. But I could understand how that when people don't wrap their heads around that basic idea that hey, this person is in charge and we need to obey them. When they don't wrap their heads around this idea that God is the progenitor of all life in the universe and we need to obey him, then, they deserve whatever harm befalls them. That's just real. And if you want someone like uh, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to change their folk, or not him, he's not president anymore, but you want someone like Bashar al-Assad to change their focus, then submit to them and see if things get any better. But you're never going to find out how much better things might be if you never actually submit to them. As much as you hate it, and I understand that the title Ayatollah actually means image of God, and Ayatollahs tend to be pretty hardcore guys, and well, there you have it. Their idea of God is that God is a hard God, and I actually agree with that, obviously. And so, hey, you know, that's just kind of how this God element of the mind works. It doesn't mean that the person actually thinks they're a God. They might not even realize that they've crossed over into demigodhood. They're just thinking of themselves as a national leader, and they just know that they have a very organized way of thinking, and that they want to take their concept of life and make anybody under their